is none other than Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. This is the Babylonian Empire and Nebuchadnezzar, that first king. And from archaeology, by the way, we know Babylon did have a lot of winged lions on its architecture. If you look back on archaeological things and you see all the stuff we still have in that part of Iran, Iraq, etc. today, it's amazing how this was a symbol of the Babylonian Empire. Now, what does it mean, the clipped wings and the man's heart? Well, perhaps the clipped wings is a reference to Nebuchadnezzar's insanity. In other words, here is this high-flying bird, if you will, but you clip his wings, and he is grounded. And of course, as you know, as we know from Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar was indeed made to be like an animal, live amongst the wild beasts, etc., for a time. And then when it says it was eventually given a man's heart, maybe that refers to his restoration, basically back to acting like a human again. Or maybe this is simply a reference that as the years passed, the Babylonian Empire waned and became weaker and weaker, and that's why the Medo-Persian Empire was able to take over. Verse 5, behold, another beast, a second like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, arise, devour much flesh. Once again, notice the simile. So here we're dealing with another animal that we are aware of. We know what a bear looks like, etc. But this is kind of a, there again, it has some things that we kind of say, well, what do they mean? But at least we can understand the bear part. And this is then the Medo-Persian Empire. And as you see on the second timeline at the top of your sheet, that's exactly what happened in history when the Babylonian Empire fell in 539, thereabouts. The Medo-Persian Empire took over. When it says it raised itself on one side, probably that is a reference to the dominance of Persia over Media. Okay, even though we say Medo-Persian Empire, and the word Medo we usually put first, actually the Persian Empire, or the Persian part of it, if you will, is what predominated. And it had between the teeth of it these ribs, so 3 ribs in the mouth. Is probably simply a picture of conquest or devouring countries and making them part of the empire. So just as a bear, if you saw ribs in the mouth of a bear, you would say, well, yeah, a bear is ferocious. It goes out and it finds prey and it devours them. Well, that's simply now being transferred to a king and a kingdom. And of course, as we know, the Medo-Persian Empire did indeed expand. When they took over from Babylon over here, they went to the east toward India, but they also went toward the west and expanded even what Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians had. So I don't think we need to identify specific countries. Sometimes people would say, oh, well, what are the 3 countries we're talking about? Well, they conquered a lot more than 3 countries, so I don't think that's the point here. It's just they're out devouring. Verse 6. And by the way, if you have questions, comments, corrections, additions, deletions, whatever, don't hesitate to interject them here, as otherwise I'm going to keep moving. Verse 6, after this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given unto it. Okay? So now we are talking again, notice the simile, like a leopard. So we're familiar with a leopard. A leopard is, again, somewhat ferocious, but it is a very fast animal. And but interestingly, now all of a sudden, it is a leopard with 4 wings on it. And the wings, again, probably are a reference to the speed. But the 4 is going to be significant, as we're going to see in just a moment. So this is a reference now to the next empire. Notice on the timeline, the Grecian Empire. And the first king there was Alexander the Great, who took over about 336. Some would date it 334 BC. And Alexander the Great was known for the speed with which he conquered. So a leopard with 4 wings fits in just perfectly with what we know from history. In fact, even though his rule was very brief, he died in 323 BC, so he only really was ruling about 13 years. In that time, he conquered more than Cyrus the Great, Cyrus the Persian did in over 3 decades. Okay, so in other words, he really did quickly accomplish a lot. And then it says there were the 4 wings. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. So what do we have here? Well, we know from history that 4 generals eventually took over the parcel of land. Alexander did not really, some say he really did not have a legitimate heir, and others say, well, no, he really did have 2 sons, but they both had died earlier. Whatever the case is, when he died, he didn't just have somebody to handily turn the empire over to. So there was fighting for some years between 4 generals, and basically they then took over what we might call 4 parcels of the empire. So we have a general named Lysimachus, who took over Thrace and Bithynia. Thrace and Bithynia, you can look on a map, are up here in the northern part of Asia Minor. So he got that piece of real estate. Cassander took over Macedonia and Greece. So another general took over this basic area right here. And then the 2 that really are going to come into play later in the book of Daniel and in biblical history are the Seleucid dynasty, and that's up here in the area of the Seleucids. That's in the area of Syria and Asia Minor, the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And then we had the Ptolemies, who got this portion down here of Egypt. Okay, the Ptolemies, the Ptolemaic dynasty. And you can see why these 2 are going to come into a good bit of play biblically, because who do you have nestled right between them? The Jews, God's people, are right between them. And so there are going to be many, many years when there are battles between the 2, and Israel is going to, or the Jews are going to be, shall we say, stuck there. Okay? So that's what verse 6 tells us. And finally, verse 7. And by the way, it's really interesting when you think of how great Alexander was, and when you think of these empires, how great they were. And yet God can relegate their entire history of even centuries to simply one verse and say, oh yeah, this nation was raised up and now it fell. And it's kind of humbling when you think of, I often like to kind of think of years in light of, say, how long America's been around. And, we say, wow, look at this building. It's 110 years old. 110 years old, it was built yesterday, huh? I mean, you go to England and here is something that was built 700 years ago that is still standing. And when we think of countries and how long they've stood, and we just say, wow. And yet when God looks at them, it's almost like he's writing another story and he just puts a footnote. Oh, by the way, for 300 years, this country was ruling, and you remember this guy's name, Putin or whoever, who thought he was such a kingpin. He doesn't even deserve a footnote on a footnote on a footnote. Well, that's because God is in control, and he's moving all of these events toward his glorious future. Okay? And that's where, as we're going to see as we continue and as we conclude, that we keep that kind of view ourselves, and we don't just become so myopic that all we see is this little bit in front of us, instead of keeping a bigger picture of God's glorious work. And so in verse 7, after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly. It had great iron teeth that devoured and brake in pieces and stamped the residue with the feet of it. It was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Okay? So it's diverse from the other beasts, and so notice we don't have a simile here. He doesn't say, and this beast is like some beast that you're familiar with. He says, this beast is so horrendously bad and different, I'm not even going to use a beast you're familiar with to compare it to. He says it can't be compared like the others. It's dreadful, it's terrible, it has iron teeth to devour anything in its way. Verse 19, later in the chapter, says it had claws of bronze, so it could tear into things and stamp on them with its feet. It also had 10 horns, which are 10 kingdoms. So you say, well, what are we talking about here? Well, look at your timeline at the top. And following the Grecian Empire, we have the Romans from roughly 63 BC down to AD 476. So the 10 horns would seem to be the various kingdoms that comprised it. And probably here again, this is a place where we simply need to exercise some reverent agnosticism, where we say, well, what were those 10 kings in that original Roman Empire and so on? Again, depending on how you count things, you might come up with 8 or you might come up with 13 or who knows what. So again, I don't think the point is that we need to hone in too much on which 10 are we talking about. But verse 8, I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things. And so as Daniel was looking, there came up another little horn that uprooted 3 of the horns. And this definitely seems to be a reference to the Antichrist, who, even though he begins small, is going to hold a tremendous sway in these days. Now maybe you say, wait a minute, verse 7, we were dealing with the Roman Empire, and on your timeline there you see the Roman Empire ended in about 476 BC, and I thought the Antichrist, if we would say you are here, this is where we are, I thought the Antichrist was even future to us. So what in the world is going on here? Well, you're exactly right. The Antichrist is still future to us, but this seems to be one of those places in the Bible where we actually have a huge time gap between verses. We're going to see it a couple of times when we get to chapter 8. We see it other places in the Bible as well, where literally you have back-to-back verses that sound like you go from this verse to this verse, and it would be the very next event on the calendar, but in reality, it's not. There are years and years and years between them. Even Jesus, when he preached a sermon, cut off in the middle of a verse in Isaiah because of the time difference in that particular verse. So what we seem to have here is between verse 7, so you have verse 7 is right here, and verse 8 is right here. So what do you have? You have at least what we might call a 1,500 plus year gap between that. And if the end doesn't come for another 2, 3, 4, 500 years, well, this might be a 2,000 year gap in the text here, okay? We don't really know, but there does appear to be this particular gap. And so verse 8 is actually talking about what we would call the reconstituted or the revived Roman Empire. And we know that after this time in which we're living, when the rapture occurs, and you see this on your timeline at the top there, then you have this 7-year tribulation period, and that's when the Antichrist will be made public, etc. Okay? So it's very important, I think, that we notice this gap there. Now, what does it mean in verse 8 when it says this other little horn had in his horn were eyes like the eyes of a man and a mouth speaking great things? Well, the eyes perhaps are referring to like his charm or his appealingness or his attractiveness, almost like we would say his magnetism. Have you ever met somebody that you found out later was a criminal, but boy, were they just so friendly and cordial, and when you met him, it was like, man, that person was such a nice individual, he just seemed to pay attention to you, etc. And then you find out the guy is a jerk, to the hilt. Well, it seems that, and this is not just from one verse, we find this over and over with the Antichrist. He's going to be somebody who can just charm you to death. He can just charm you to your death, shall we say. And that's kind of, I think, what's going on here. And it says he has a mouth speaking great things. On your sheet, I gave you 4 other references where it also says in this chapter, where it says he has a mouth speaking great things. And verse 25 actually says it's blasphemy against God. So the overall picture we get from the Bible, this chapter and elsewhere, of the Antichrist is he is a slick talker. He is slippery with his tongue. Have you ever known anybody like that? Have you ever known politicians, we shouldn't slam car salesmen, should we? Have you ever known just anybody that, yeah, they really knew how to make you think that you were the only person and they care about you and blah, blah, blah. and they were just taking you to the cleaners the whole time they were talking to you. Well, that's the kind of person the Antichrist is going to be. Verse 9, I beheld, says Daniel, till the thrones were cast down, is the King James Version, but actually the meaning is set up or established. So if you look at like the New King James Version, it says the thrones were put in place, or the ESV has the thrones were placed. Not exactly sure why King James said cast down here, because it's the thrones were established, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, the hair of his head like the pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. Okay? So, breaking it down, why does it say, I beheld till the thrones were established? Why the plural here? Well, there have been a lot of guesses by commentators. Some say because God has one throne and Christ another. Some say God has one throne and David another. Some say it's referring to God's throne and then his footstool was like a throne. But actually, as it goes on here, it's evident that there was only one throne. So this seems to be a place where you have what we call with the Hebrew language a plural of majesty, where the word is actually plural, but it's referring to a singular thing to emphasize the majesticness of something. So there's only one throne here, because we're told the Ancient of Days sat down on that one throne. Who is the Ancient of Days? Some would say it is Christ. I think by far the best interpretation is this is actually God the Father, because in just a moment we're going to see another reference that would be Christ is coming to him. So some people would say, well, wait a minute, I thought in light of New Testament verses that Christ is the one who has ultimate authority to judge. And you're right, that is true. However, that was when the Father delegated some of the judgment to him, so this isn't a contradiction to say that God is also judging. It says his garment is white as snow. Notice again a simile to just try and help us understand a little bit. So what's the point of comparison? Is it saying his garment was white instead of being purple or teal or green or whatever? No, the point seems to be white stands for purity as well as for absolute justice. His hair is like pure wool. It is white, probably referring, because the hair of his head is white, we often think of gray-haired people as having great maturity, wisdom, capability for judgment, etc. So probably that's the case here. Throne like the fiery flame, and as you see, the word like is in italics, so it's not really there, but it is legitimate to make a comparison. And as we look at other places in the Bible, fire is often associated with God's splendor or majesty, his presence, etc. And then wheels as a burning fire. So it's like a chariot throne that is movable. So what in the world is going on here? Well, perhaps it's just to tell us that the throne really was kind of like a movable throne. Maybe it's to symbolize omnipresence. When you think of something that moves, you think of something that is in a lot of different places. So maybe this is God's way of simply reminding us the ultimate judge is omnipresent. Or maybe God is telling us, hey, you ought to just be reverently agnostic here. You're kind of missing the boat on what this means, and so that's fine. But the overall picture really is this is just spectacular. This is just an awesome picture of God revealing his glory as all these world kingdoms come to an end, and now he hands over the eternal kingdom to his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, to rule sovereignly forever. Verse 10, a fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. Thousands ministered unto him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him, and the judgment was set, and the books were opened. Again, the fiery stream is almost like what today we would probably call a lava flow from a volcano, just super impressive. Thousands, 10,000 times 10,000, that would be hundreds of millions of celestial beings waiting upon God. And of course, that is possible, but perhaps it's also just hyperbole. In other words, it is conscious exaggeration for effect. You just can't even count the number of royal attendants around the throne. And the books were open. You can go back to Revelation chapter 20 to find the fulfillment of this. Verse 11, I beheld then because of the voice of the great words which the horn, Antichrist, spoke. I beheld till the beast was slain and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. So it appears here that the Antichrist is going to continue his, shall we say, slick speaking, blasphemous words against God until he can't do it anymore, until God ultimately judges him. So you could cross-reference this with Revelation chapter 19, the last couple verses there, where it talks about how at the second coming of Christ, he will be cast into the lake of fire. Verse 12 is concerning the rest of the beasts. They had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. This is kind of difficult, and you can see a couple of questions I ask on your sheet. Not exactly sure what's going on here. Verse 13, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. So with the destruction of all these earthly kingdoms, all the way from way back here, the Old Testament days, all the way through today and up till the very end, with the destruction of all these earthly kingdoms, Daniel now saw one like the Son of Man coming in the clouds to God the Father. And this is, of course, Jesus Christ coming to receive the kingdom that God had promised him. And notice the specific expression there where it says, one like the Son of Man. This identifies this final world ruler as being a man, as being human, but more than human, because he is a creature coming from heaven. And of course, when you think of the New Testament, over and over as you read in the Gospels, Jesus' favorite self-expression was the Son of Man, reminding us of his humanity. And no doubt every time he said it, it's almost like he was saying, hint, hint, do you realize who I am? Think back of Daniel, the book that the Old Testament book that you claim as part of your canon. Make the connection there. I am this Son of Man. I am man, but I am also deity. And so that day will come when indeed true man and yet true God will be ruling for eternity. In verse 14, and there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. Note the three expressions that emphasize the eternality of his kingdom. It's an everlasting kingdom. It will not pass away, and it will never be destroyed. And what a contrast that is to these powerful kingdoms that Daniel saw in his vision. Every one of them, even though it looked like they were strong, it was like, who could ever bring this kingdom and this king to his knees? Well, there was an end for those kingdoms, but there will not be an end to this kingdom. Verse 15, I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit in the midst of my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. So Daniel is dazed, he's alarmed, he's perplexed, and no wonder. This is difficult stuff. And so he asks two questions to get an interpretation. So in verse 16, I came near unto one of them that stood by, that's probably a reference to an angel, and I asked him the truth of all this. So he told me and made me know the interpretation of the things. So Daniel is going to ask two questions, and we'll get God's interpretation. In verses 16 to 18, we find question number one to the angel, which is very general. What does all this mean? And the answer, verse 17, these great beasts, which are four kings, which shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall take the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. So in other words, God answers the question in one broad sweep, and he simply says these kingdoms we're talking about, these wild beasts you saw, are simply kings and kingdoms that are going to be ruling. But ultimately, the saints of the Most High, the saints of God, are going to ultimately rule for eternity, reminding us of that which is even future to us. So in verses 19 to 22, Daniel has another question. Then I would know the truth of the fourth beast, which was diverse from all the others, exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron, his nails of brass. He devoured, brake in pieces, stamped the residue with his feet. And of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell, even of that horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. Okay, so Daniel now asks this question. He says, well, can you further explain to me the truth of the 4th beast that is so diverse? So he's getting much more specific. And basically, Daniel just repeated everything that we've already been told about the Antichrist. But notice in verse 20, at the very end, he adds a couple of things when he says his look was more stout than his fellows. Seems to simply mean his appearance was larger than the others. In other words, he had a more imposing, if you will, personality to him, a more imposing appearance about him. His horn was larger than the others. And verse 21, I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them. So this horn is the Antichrist, who's going to make war with the saints and defeat them, but only for a limited time. So now we are moving down here to a time even after us, because this is in the 7-year tribulation period when the Antichrist is going to be coming to the fore and wreaking havoc on those who claim the name of Christ. So in verse 22, his power will only be until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came until the saints possessed the kingdom. Then the answer in verses 23 to 27, he said, the 4th beast shall be the 4th kingdom upon earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down and break it in pieces. The 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise. Another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and subdue 3 kings. He shall speak, that is, this predominant one, the Antichrist, shall speak great words against the Most High, shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and dividing of time. But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and to destroy it unto the end. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominions shall serve, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. So the 4th kingdom is indeed different, and it will subdue all peoples, referring to the biblical world of the greater Mediterranean area. So it's specifically talking about all this area around here and how the Antichrist is going to be ruling there. And this is, as I mentioned before, what we basically call the restored Roman Empire that will be comprised of about 10 kingdoms, but another king, the Antichrist, the future ruler, will subdue them. And notice in verse 25, 3 characteristics specifically of him. Once again, it emphasizes his speaking, his slippery tongue. He will speak great words, and this time it's blasphemy against the Most High, that is, against God. He shall wear out the saints. This seems to simply refer to wearing down the saints, harassing them, oppressing them, such as ungodly governments do today when they try and suppress Christianity or wear down believers. It's like, if we just keep doing this and this and this, you'll finally get to the point you'll say, what's the use? I give up. And then it says he will change times and laws. It probably means he'll change the normal things of life. He'll impose a new system, basically a new calendar that removes anything religious, etc. But it says his power and authority will only last a time, a times, and half a time. So that is a time, that's 1 year, 2 times, add 2 more years, and half a time, add a half a year. So that's 3.5 years. Again, from other biblical references, we know that that is a reference to the last 3.5 years of the tribulation period. And the Bible does tell us that that is going to be an intense time. The Antichrist will probably be jacking it up here toward the beginning, but then when we get to the middle is when there will definitely be some changes, and the last 3.5 years are really going to be intensely furious as he tries to reign. And so again, you can see that on the timeline up at the top there, exactly how that would fit in. But verses 26 and 27 are a great reminder that God will sit in judgment and remove him from his kingdom. And back in Revelation chapter 19, verses 19 and 20, it says he will be cast alive into the lake of fire, and the kingdom will be the Lord's for eternity, and everybody will serve the king. Verse 28, hitherto is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my cogitations much troubled me. My countenance changed in me, but I kept the matter in my heart. Well, this is the end of the interpretation, but Daniel is still alarmed, and no wonder. I mean, boy, have you ever had a bad dream and you kind of woke up in a cold sweat, as we would say, and it's like, what did all that mean? What is that going to bode for me today, etc.? And so it appears here that even the look on Daniel's face was still just a troubled look, kind of like he's just dazed. It just drained him. But I wonder if this isn't simply what we find at other places in the Bible, and I gave you the references there, how when people have been in the very presence of God, they're a changed individual. You think of Joshua when he met the captain of the Lord's host. And the book of Joshua there says he fell on his face in worship. You think of Isaiah, his great vision in Isaiah 6. He said, "Woe is me, I am so sinful." And he worshiped. You think of Ezekiel, who fell on his face. You think of John in Revelation. He had a vision of Christ, and he fell on his face as if he was dead. It just took the wind out of his sails, as we might say. And I think that's a good, shall we say, takeaway even from a chapter like this. It reminds us that when we read the Bible, I think sometimes, we just kind of read the Bible and then we just close it and say, okay, now let's see, I need to balance my checkbook and I have an appointment to get the oil change in my truck, and we just kind of go on with stuff instead of sitting there for a moment and just being overwhelmed with what we just read and just basically drained. It's like, man, this just super humbles me reading this in the Word of God. I think another great takeaway is, and we've been saying this and we'll say it more, and I think God's simply repeating it here because his people need this reiterated in their ears, but simply God wins. All this earthly power, all this showmanship, all this glitz, all these world rulers who think they're really in control of stuff. And like I said before, most of them are not even a footnote on a footnote in the pages of world history. But God is in sovereign control. He raised them up. They did what they were supposed to do. They did what they wanted to do, but they were actually accomplishing his purpose. And God's the winner. And therefore, today you hear a lot of people saying, well, you better take this position so you're on the right side of history. I laugh whenever I hear that, and I say, you better get saved so you're sure to be on the right side of history for eternity. Because if you don't take God's position, you're going to be on the wrong side, not just now, but forever. And then finally, I would simply say, as we read chapters like this, there's so much mystery even in the midst of what we do get. Don't lose sight of the forest for the trees. You can go out to a lovely forest and get so fixated on one tree and the root system and questioning, well, I wonder how this happened, and what about this little bug on it, etc. And you fail to see the glorious splendor of the whole forest. The lovely colors and the majesty of it and all kinds of stuff like that. And while we do look at the individual trees, etc., we want to be sure that we don't just get so perplexed by a question we don't have answered from one tree that we forget to see the glorious beauty of God in the whole forest. Okay, that is mighty fast, okay? Maybe you're dazed, glazed, whatever as well. Any concluding questions, comments, corrections? Laura? It's talking about another 10 here. So you're saying, how did we have 10 kingdoms back here and now there's another 10 in the revived? Well, and of course today some people have tried, especially with the European Union, to say, aha, look at the kings and wow, we need one more nation to join the European Union so we get our 10 and all. And that's where I say, I think we need to exercise a lot of caution and so forth, and not just say, well, if they're as soon as there are 10 kings in the European Union, we know it's the last days and the Lord has to come, because it might go up to 13 and drop to 8 and back to 12 and who knows what. I think the point there is, again, is not the significance of each individual kingdom. We've got to count them. It's just we know back here that there were like individual city-state kingdom things during the Roman Empire, and it will be somewhat of the same. Okay, I guess our time is gone for today, so Lord bless you. Have a great week in solitary confinement.